The drought had been merciless that summer of 1878, turning the grasslands around Dry Willow into a brittle carpet of yellow and brown. Abel Cross guided the Red Butte cattle through the parched terrain with nothing but his voice and the gentle pressure of his knees against his horse's flanks. No whip hung from his saddle horn. Never had. Never would. At nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad as a barn beam, Abel cut an imposing figure against the endless Wyoming sky. The other cowhands gave him a wide berth, not from meanness on his part, but from the stories that grew wilder with each telling. That Cross fellow bent an iron bar with his bare hands. They'd whisper. Saw him lift a full-grown steer clean off the ground. The tales multiplied like tumbleweeds, rolling through saloons and general stores until Abel had become something more myth than man. The cattle moved in a lazy river of dust and hide, their bells clanking a drowsy rhythm. Abel's eyes, the color of worn leather, tracked each animal with practiced ease. When they reached Willow Creek, what was left of it in this dry spell, he dismounted with surprising grace for a man his size. His boots left deep impressions in the cracked earth, while the cattle drank from the muddy trickle. Abel noticed movement in the rocks above, a young hawk, its wing bent at an unnatural angle, struggled against the limestone. The other men were watering their horses downstream, paying him no mind. Abel climbed the rocks with careful movements, his massive hands finding holds that seemed impossibly small. The hawk hissed and struck with its good wing, but Abel simply waited, patient as stone. When the bird tired, he scooped it up in hands that could span a dinner plate, cradling it like spun glass. The wing wasn't broken, just badly sprained. He'd seen enough injuries, in animals and men, to know. Working quickly, Abel fashioned a splint from a twig and strips torn from his bandana. The hawk's heart hammered against his palm, quick as raindrops. He found a shadowed crevice in the rocks, cool and protected, and settled the bird inside with a handful of dried beef from his saddlebag. "You'll mend," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to calm the creature. "Give it time." Back at Red Butte Ranch, the day's work stretched long past sunset. Abel mended fence posts that other men had given up on, each strike of his hammer precise despite the fading light. In the bunkhouse, the hands played cards and passed a bottle, their laughter sharp in the evening air. Abel sat apart, working oil into a cracked saddle leather. "Cross!" Wade Caldwell's voice cut through the chatter. The boss's son stood in the doorway, his clean clothes and polished boots marking him as a man who watched others work. "Pa wants to see you." The main house squatted like a toad on the best piece of land for miles, its windows glowing yellow in the darkness. James Caldwell sat behind his desk, papers spread before him like playing cards. He didn't look up when Abel entered, just continued scratching figures with his pen. "Got a telegram today," Caldwell said finally. "Dry Willow's getting a new nurse, also knows telegraphy. Apparently. Coming from St. Louis." He set down his pen and fixed Abel with a look that might have been carved from the same stone as the valley walls. "Town's all stirred up about it. A woman, traveling alone, taking on men's work." Abel said nothing. There was rarely a right answer when Caldwell got to talking. "I run a working ranch, not a social club," Caldwell continued. "My men keep their minds on cattle and fence posts, not on city women with fancy ideas. That includes you, Cross, especially you." His eyes narrowed. "A man your size causes enough talk without adding fuel to the fire. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Good. You're worth 3 regular hands when you keep your head down and work. Don't make me regret keeping you on." The dismissal was clear. Abel ducked through the doorway and walked back to the bunkhouse, the night air cool against his face. Inside, Wade had joined the card game, his voice loud with whiskey and bravado. "You see the way folks scatter when the giant walks through town?" Wade was saying. "Like Moses parting the Red Sea, except it's Moses who might snap you in half if you look at him wrong." The laughter that followed had an ugly edge to it. Abel climbed into his bunk without a word, the rope supports creaking under his weight. He'd reinforced them himself, twice, But they still protested. In the darkness, he thought about the hawk in its stone shelter. Tomorrow he'd check on it before the others woke. Maybe bring it some fresh meat. The wing would heal clean if given the chance. Most things would, if folks just knew to be gentle with them. He thought, too, about the telegram Caldwell had mentioned. A woman from St. Louis, coming to nurse the sick and work the telegraph. Abel had seen the fear in men's eyes when injury or illness struck, had watched them suffer rather than admit they needed tending. Maybe someone new would change that. Maybe not. Change came slow to places like Dry Willow, slow as spring after a hard winter. The other men's snores filled the darkness, but sleep eluded Abel. He lay still, aware of every creak of his bunk, every shift that might wake the others. It was a practiced stillness, learned from years of being too big for the spaces life provided. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, another day of wide berths and whispered stories. But somewhere in the rocks above Willow Creek, a hawk rested in the cool darkness, its wing carefully splinted by hands that knew how to be gentle despite their size. That was something. At least, in a world that expected only hardness from him, these small acts of care were Abel's quiet rebellion. The moon rose over the Wyoming grasslands, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. In a week, maybe two, the woman from St. Louis would arrive. The town would buzz with gossip and speculation, and Caldwell would watch his men like a hawk himself, ready to swoop at the first sign of trouble. Abel closed his eyes and tried to find sleep. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of labor, rested peacefully at his sides. The same hands that could lift a calf or dig a post hole in the hardest ground had spent the evening fashioning a splint small enough for a hawk's wing. It was a contradiction that the people of Dry Willow couldn't seem to understand, that strength and gentleness could exist in the same body, the same heart. The telegram had said she was coming to help, to heal. Abel wondered what she'd make of a place like this, where the dust never quite settled and the men were as hard as the land they worked. He wondered, too, what the town would make of her. But mostly, he wondered about the hawk, alone in its stone shelter, trusting the giant stranger who'd shown it kindness. Trust was a fragile thing, easily broken by rough handling. Abel knew that better than most. Tomorrow, he'd check the splint, adjust it if needed, leave more food and water. It was a small thing, saving one hawk in a territory full of predators and prey. But small things mattered. They were what made a life. In the end, not the stories people told about you, but the quiet truths you carried in your hands. The stagecoach should have arrived by noon, but the sun had already begun its descent toward the mountains when Margaret Hale finally saw the outline of Dry Willow shimmering in the heat. Her traveling dress, once crisp gray cotton, now bore the dust of 3 states. She'd stopped trying to brush it clean somewhere outside Cheyenne. The coach lurched to a stop with a groan that matched her own bones. 3 days of constant jostling had left her feeling like a sack of flour that had been kicked down a hillside. The driver, a leathery man who'd spoken perhaps 10 words the entire journey, climbed down to unload her trunks. "This is it?" Margaret asked, surveying the collection of weathered buildings that comprised the town. "This is it," he confirmed, hefting her medical bag. "Doc Morrison's place is the white building with the cross. General Stores across the way. You'll want to check in with Mayor Hutchins. He runs the bank." Margaret paid the driver and watched the coach disappear in a cloud of dust, heading toward the next settlement. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of a sign in the wind. She was truly alone now, a widow of 6 months standing in a town that looked like it might blow away in a strong wind. The wheels of her small cart, purchased in Laramie with the last of her traveling money, sank into the sandy Main Street. She'd made it perhaps 20 yards when the inevitable happened. The right wheel caught in a particularly deep rut and stuck fast. Margaret set her shoulder against the cart and pushed, but it was like trying to move a mountain. "Lord, give me strength," she muttered, aware that several townspeople had stopped to watch the entertainment of a city woman wrestling with Wyoming soil. A shadow fell across her, and Margaret looked up, and up, and up some more. The man standing before her was the largest human being she'd ever encountered. He topped her by well over a foot, with shoulders that blocked out a considerable portion of the sky. His face, shaded by a worn hat, was weathered but not unkind. What struck her most were his hands. Massive, yes, but held carefully at his sides, as if he was conscious of their power. Without a word, he bent and gripped the cart's frame. The muscles in his arms bunched beneath his shirt, and the cart rose from the rut as easily as Margaret might lift a tea kettle. He set it on firmer ground, then stepped back, his movements surprisingly delicate for someone his size. "Thank you," Margaret said, finding her voice. "I'm Margaret Hale, the new nurse." The giant touched his hat brim. "Abel Cross. Ma'am, welcome to Dry Willow." His voice was deep but quiet, like distant thunder. Before she could say more, he turned and walked away, his long strides carrying him quickly down the street. Margaret noticed how people stepped aside without seeming to realize they were doing it, creating a clear path wherever he went. "That's the Cross fellow," a woman's voice said beside her. Margaret turned to find a thin woman in a flour-dusted apron, arms crossed. "Best keep your distance, man that size. Well, there's something not natural about it. He seemed perfectly courteous to me," Margaret replied, irritated by the assumption. The woman sniffed. "That's how it starts. But you didn't see him last winter, pulling a wagon out of a snowdrift with his bare hands, or the time he carried 2 grown men out of a barn fire, one under each arm." She leaned closer, voice dropping. "They say he killed a man once, over in Montana, squeezed the life right out of him." Margaret had heard enough. "Thank you for the warning. Now, if you could direct me to my lodgings." The woman pointed to a narrow building squeezed between the barber shop and the undertaker. "Mrs. Wickham runs the boarding house. She's expecting you." Margaret's room was small but clean, with a window overlooking the back streets of town. She unpacked methodically, hanging her 3 dresses in the wardrobe, arranging her medical instruments in their leather case. Tomorrow she'd meet with the mayor and inspect the clinic. Tonight, she just wanted to wash the travel dust away and sleep in a bed that didn't move. But first, she needed provisions. The general store was busy with the evening trade, ranchers and townspeople gathering supplies. Margaret selected basic items: tea, tinned goods, soap, aware of the conversations dying as she passed. She was examining a bolt of calico when she noticed it, a row of glass jars on a high shelf, filled with golden honey. Each jar had a small wooden label, the letters carved with obvious care. "That's Cross honey," the shopkeeper said, following her gaze. "He keeps bees out past the willows. Good for wounds and coughs, though most folks—" He trailed off. "Uncomfortable. Though most folks what? Well, they'd rather suffer than take charity from him. Bad luck, some say, taking food from unnatural hands." Margaret felt her temper rise. "I'll take 2 jars, please." "2, ma'am? I don't think—" "2 jars," she repeated firmly. "And I'll need them wrapped carefully. Medical supplies." She left the store with her purchases, aware of the whispers following her. Let them talk. She'd faced worse gossip in St. Louis after Thomas died, when the creditors came calling and she'd had to sell everything but her medical knowledge to survive. The next morning brought her first real challenge. A boy of perhaps 10 appeared at her door, hat crushed in his hands. "Please, ma'am, it's my ma. She's powerful sick. Won't get out of bed." Margaret grabbed her bag and followed him to a small homestead on the edge of town. The woman inside was burning with fever, her breathing labored. Margaret examined her carefully, finding the telltale signs of lung inflammation. "I need hot water," she told the boy. "Clean cloths." "And honey, do you have any?" The boy shook his head. "Pa won't buy Cross honey. Says it's cursed." Margaret bit back her response and unwrapped one of her jars. She mixed the honey with hot water and herbs from her bag, creating a soothing syrup. Within an hour, the woman's breathing had eased. Margaret left instructions for continued treatment and promised to return. Walking back through town, She noticed Abel Cross near the livery stable, carefully adjusting the harness on a horse that looked like a child's pony next to him. He worked with infinite patience, never forcing, just gentle adjustments until the animal stood comfortable. Their eyes met across the street. He touched his hat again, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as his standard greeting. Margaret nodded back, then on impulse, raised the remaining jar of honey. "Good for wounds," she called. The shopkeeper was right. Something shifted in his weathered face. Surprise, perhaps, or a carefully guarded pleasure. He nodded once, then returned to his work. That evening, Margaret sat at her window, writing in her journal by lamplight. The town was settling into sleep, but she could see a faint glow in the distance. Past the stand of willows the shopkeeper had mentioned, she imagined Abel Cross tending his bees, those massive hands working with the same gentle precision she'd witnessed with the horse. In St. Louis, she'd been surrounded by educated men who spoke beautifully and accomplished little. Here was a man who spoke barely at all but had lifted her cart from the mud without being asked, who kept bees and carved labels with careful letters, who the town feared for his strength yet came to for honey when desperate enough. Margaret had come west to start over, to use her skills where they were needed most. She hadn't expected to find puzzles like Abel Cross, men judged by their size rather than their actions, condemned for the very strength that made them valuable. She closed her journal and prepared for bed, her mind already turning to tomorrow's challenges. There would be more sick to tend, more suspicious looks to weather, more whispered warnings about the giant who kept bees. But Margaret Hale had buried a husband, survived bankruptcy, and traveled half a continent alone. She could handle a bit of small-town gossip. And perhaps, in time, she could help this town see what she'd glimpsed today. That gentleness could live in the most unexpected places, including the hands of a giant. The scream cut through the afternoon heat like a knife through butter. Margaret dropped the bandages she'd been rolling and ran toward the sound, her medical bag banging against her hip. A crowd had already gathered at Olson's sawmill, their faces grave with the particular stillness that meant catastrophe. "Let me through." Margaret pushed past the gawkers until she reached the center of the commotion. Young Pete Olson lay trapped beneath a massive beam that had fallen from the rafters. His leg bent at an unnatural angle. His father knelt beside him, face white as flour. "It slipped from the chains," someone explained. "Came down fast. We can't lift it. Must weigh 300 pounds. Margaret assessed quickly. The beam pressed across Pete's thigh, cutting off circulation. Every minute counted. "We need leverage," she said. "Poles. Anything." "Already tried," Olson said desperately. "Takes 4 men just to budget, and there's no room to work without risking crushing him worse." Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, each one inadequate. Then she heard the crowd stir and part behind her. Abel Cross stood at the edge of the circle, his hat in his hands. "Mr. Cross," she called without hesitation. "I need your help." The crowd muttered, but Abel was already moving. He studied the situation with those careful eyes, then positioned himself at the optimal angle. "When I lift," he told Margaret quietly, "you pull him free, quick as you can. The rest of you, get ready to brace it once it's up." Margaret ordered. The men scrambled for positions. Abel gripped the beam, took a breath that expanded his chest like a bellows, and lifted. The massive timber rose slowly, steadily, his face reddening with effort, but his hands rock steady. Margaret didn't waste a second, grabbing Pete under the arms and sliding him free with the Olsons' help. "Now!" she barked, and the men rushed in with support poles as Abel guided the beam down onto them. It landed with a thud that shook the ground. Margaret was already examining Pete's leg, her hands swift and sure. "The bone's intact," she announced, relief flooding through her. "Badly bruised, possibly fractured, but not crushed." She looked up at Abel, who stood quietly to one side, flexing his hands. "Thank you." He nodded and turned to go, but Margaret caught his sleeve. "Your hands, let me look." They're fine. Ma'am? I'll be the judge of that. Her tone brooked no argument. Abel hesitated, then slowly extended his hands. The palms were scraped raw from the rough wood, several splinters embedded deep. "Come to the clinic," she said. "Those need tending." An hour later, in the converted storeroom that served as Dry Willow's medical facility, Margaret worked on extracting splinters from Abel's massive palms. He sat still as stone, though she knew it must hurt. "You don't flinch," she observed, probing for a particularly deep splinter. "Learn not to," he said simply. "From working cattle? From being big?" He watched her work with those thoughtful eyes. People get nervous when a large man shows pain, makes them think of what might happen if he gets angry. Margaret paused in her work, struck by the matter-of-fact sadness in his voice. That must be a lonely way to live. Abel shrugged slightly. "It's just how things are." She resumed her work in silence, cleaning each wound with honey water before wrapping his hands in clean bandages. As she tied off the last knot, she said, "That makeshift clinic in the storeroom won't do. We need a proper space for treating patients. Doc Morrison made do. Doc Morrison didn't have to perform surgery by lamplight or deliver babies on a rickety table." She gathered her supplies with brisk movements. "I've been surveying empty buildings. The old granary has good bones, plenty of space, but it needs work." Abel flexed his bandaged hands experimentally. "What kind of work?" "Everything. Shelves, examination tables, a proper surgical station. The mayor says there's no budget for it until spring." "Spring's too late," Abel said. "Winter brings accidents, frostbite, births that can't wait for better weather." Margaret looked at him with surprise. "Exactly. But unless I can find volunteers—" Abel stood, having to duck slightly in the low-ceilinged room. "I know woodwork. Could build what you need. I couldn't ask—" "You didn't ask. I offered." He paused at the door. "That granary sits empty anyway. Shame to waste it." Word of Abel's offer spread quickly, as everything did in Dry Willow. To Margaret's amazement, other contributions followed. Tom Brennan offered leftover lumber from his barn raising. The widow Chen donated old sheets for bandages, even suspicious misses. Wickham provided a rocking chair for the mothers. The transformation took 2 weeks. Abel worked in the evenings after his ranch duties, his bandaged hands healing even as they shaped wood into furniture. Margaret often worked alongside him, holding boards steady or sorting medical supplies. "You know carpentry," Abel observed one evening as she expertly clamped 2 boards for him to join. "My husband was hopeless with tools," Margaret said, then caught herself. She rarely mentioned Thomas. "I learned out of necessity." Abel planed a board smooth with careful strokes. "How long since he passed?" 7 months. She busied herself with organizing medicine bottles. "Consumption. I couldn't save him, despite all my training." "Sometimes saving isn't possible," Abel said quietly. "Just easing the way." Margaret looked at him, this giant man working by lamplight to build furniture for people who feared him. "Is that what you do with your bees? Ease things?" A small smile crossed his weathered face. "Bees know their business. I just give them a safe place to work." As the clinic took shape, curious children began gathering at the windows. Abel carved small wooden animals during his breaks. Bears, horses, birds, leaving them on the windowsill. The children would snatch them and run, but they always came back for more. "You're good with them," Margaret said, watching a little girl clutch a wooden rabbit. "Children see clear," Abel replied. "They know I'm big. Once they realize I won't hurt them, that's that. It's adults who complicate things." On the final day of construction, Abel built the examination table. He tested it carefully, ensuring it would hold any patient, then stepped back to survey their work. The clinic was simple but functional, with good light and clean surfaces. "It's perfect," Margaret said, emotion thick in her voice. "Thank you." Abel reached into his pocket and drew out a small wooden sign. Dry Willow Clinic was carved in neat letters, along with something else. "Margaret Hale, nurse and midwife." "Figured it should have your name," he said, "so folks know who's helping them." Margaret traced the letters with one finger. In St. Louis, she'd always been Id Mrs. Thomas Hale, or the doctor's wife. This was the first time in her life her own name had been posted for all to see. "There's one more thing," Abel said. He led her outside and around the back, where a smaller sign hung by the rear entrance. "All contributors welcome here." Contributors? The folks who helped build this place. Want them to know they belong here, regardless of what they can pay. He adjusted his hat. Widow Chen. The Mexican families from the sheep ranches. The freedmen working the railroad. Sometimes they need help but won't ask if they think they're not welcome. Margaret felt her throat tighten. That's very thoughtful." "It's practical," Abel corrected, but she saw the color rise in his neck. Healthy workers mean healthy ranches. Benefits everyone. That night, the town council held a small ceremony to officially open the clinic. Mayor Hutchins made a speech about progress and civic duty. The townspeople toured the facility, admiring the sturdy shelves and examining tables. Several made pointed comments about knowing who built this and keeping proper boundaries, but Margaret ignored them. As the crowd dispersed, she found Abel standing apart, watching the children play with their wooden animals in the fading light. "You should be proud," she said, joining him. "This will save lives." "You'll save lives," he corrected. "I just built furniture." Abel Cross, you are the most stubborn man about accepting gratitude I've ever met. That earned her another rare smile. My mother used to say the same thing. A wise woman. Is she? Gone 10 years. Fever took her and my father the same winter. He gazed at the distant mountains. I was 17. Already this size. Town didn't know what to do with me after that. Margaret understood then, perhaps for the first time, the weight he carried beyond his physical strength. To be orphaned and feared at 17. To build a life from that loneliness. It explained the careful distances he kept, the gentle way he moved through a world that expected violence from him. "Well," she said firmly, "this town knows what to do with you now. They need you, whether they admit it or not." Abel looked down at her, something shifting in those thoughtful eyes. "Careful, Mrs. Hale. Keep talking like that. People will say you're too friendly with the giant." "Let them say it," Margaret replied. "I've heard worse, and it's Miss Hale now, or Margaret, if you prefer." He tested the name carefully. "Margaret." Then, as if realizing the intimacy of it, he touched his hat and stepped back. "I should go. Early morning tomorrow." She watched him walk away, his long shadow stretching across the dusty street. Tomorrow, the clinic would open properly. There would be patients to tend, suspicious looks to weather, and slowly, carefully, trust to build. But tonight, she stood in front of the building they'd created together, the giant who carved toys for children and the widow who'd come west to heal, and felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Hope. The wind shifted wrong that September afternoon, carrying the sharp smell of smoke from the west. Margaret looked up from treating young Tim Morrison's scraped knee, her nose catching the acrid scent that every person in dry country learned to fear. "Fire," she said, just as the church bell began its frantic clanging. Within minutes, the main street filled with running figures. Men grabbed buckets and shovels. Women herded children indoors, and a rider galloped in from the Patterson ranch, his horse lathered with sweat. "Prairie fire, jump the creek," he shouted, "moving fast toward the homesteads. The Patterson place is right in its path." Margaret's heart clenched. The Pattersons had 6 children, including baby Sarah, barely 3 months old. She grabbed her medical bag, knowing Burns would need treating before the day was done. The scene at the Patterson ranch was chaos. Orange flames raced through the dry grass like a living thing, sending up walls of black smoke. Men had formed a bucket brigade from the well, but the fire was winning, creeping steadily toward the barn where the milk cows bellowed in terror. "My daughter! Mrs.!" Patterson screamed, held back by 2 neighbors. "Emma went to fetch the new calf. She's still in there!" Without breaking stride, Abel Cross emerged from the smoke like something out of legend. He'd soaked his shirt in water and wrapped it around his face, leaving his broad chest bare, In 3 strides, he reached the barn's side wall. The wooden planks, heated by the approaching fire, smoked under his hands. Abel gripped the boards and pulled. The nails shrieked as they gave way, opening a hole in the wall. Smoke billowed out, thick and choking. He disappeared inside. Margaret counted heartbeats. 5, 10, 15, before he emerged. 8-year-old Emma clutched against his chest, both of them wrapped in a wet horse blanket. The girl was coughing but conscious, her small hands fisted in Abel's hair. Margaret ran forward as Abel lowered Emma to the ground. The child's breathing was labored, her face streaked with soot. "Let me see her," Margaret said, already checking the girl's airways. Abel's hands shook as he released the child. Margaret glanced up and saw angry red burns across his shoulders where the blanket hadn't covered. "You're hurt." "See to her first," he said roughly, then turned back toward the fire. The men had managed to save the house, but the barn was lost, flames eating through the roof as the last of the livestock scattered. Margaret worked quickly, clearing Emma's lungs and wrapping her in clean cloth. The girl would recover, though she'd carry the fear of smoke for years to come. As Margaret finished, she noticed Wade Caldwell standing with a group of younger men, his clean clothes marking him as a latecomer to the fight. "Look at that," Wade said loudly, pointing at Abel, who was helping beat back spot fires with a wet blanket. "Man strips half naked in front of women and children. What's next? Dancing in the streets." "He saved my daughter, Mr. Patterson snapped, his face black with soot. "Did he?" Wade's smile was ugly. "Or did he just see a chance to play hero? Big man like that. Probably started the fire himself for the attention." The accusation was so absurd that Margaret expected laughter. Instead, she saw uncertainty flicker across several faces. Wade pressed on, his voice carrying over the crackle of dying flames. "You all saw him grab that little girl, hands all over her. Who knows what—" "Stop!" Margaret stepped forward, her voice cutting like a scalpel. "Mr. Caldwell, I examined Emma myself. Mr. Cross saved her life, nothing more." His hands were exactly where they needed to be to carry a child from a burning building. Wade turned his sneer on her. "Of course you'd defend him. Everyone knows you've been spending time together, alone, in that clinic of yours." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from pure fury. "Mr. Cross built furniture for the clinic, along with half a dozen other volunteers. Unless you're suggesting that carpentry is somehow inappropriate." "I'm suggesting," Wade said, stepping closer, "that a proper woman would be more careful about the company she keeps." "And I'm suggesting," Margaret replied, matching his step, "that a proper man would have been here fighting the fire instead of arriving late to spread gossip." A ripple went through the crowd. Wade's face darkened, but before he could respond, a hand fell on his shoulder. Abel stood there, still shirtless, burns angry across his back. "The lady's right," Abel said quietly. "Fire's the enemy here, not each other." Wade shrugged off Abel's hand with a violent motion. "Don't touch me, giant, and stay away from decent folk if you know what's good for you." Abel simply looked at him, then turned to Margaret. "My burns could use tending, if you have time." They walked to the clinic together, leaving Wade to his poison. Margaret could feel eyes following them, hear the whispers starting already. By tomorrow, the story would have grown and twisted into something unrecognizable. In the clinic, Abel sat on the reinforced stool he'd built himself while Margaret examined his burns. They were painful but not dangerous, the kind that would heal clean with proper care. "This will sting," she warned, applying honey and herb paste to the worst areas. Abel didn't flinch. "Wade's not wrong. You know, being seen with me will cause you trouble. Wade Caldwell is a small man trying to feel big by making others feel small," Margaret said firmly. "I've dealt with his type before. Not in a town this size. Stories here stick like burrs." Margaret wrapped clean bandages around his shoulders, her touch necessarily clinical despite the intimacy of the task. "Then we'll give them better stories to tell. How many people saw you save Emma today?" How many know you built the clinic? Fear speaks louder than gratitude. Abel said, Always has. She secured the last bandage and stepped back to survey her work. Then we'll have to speak louder than fear. That evening, Margaret made a decision. She wrote a simple notice and posted it on the clinic door. All those injured fighting today's fire will be treated free of charge. My thanks to Abel Cross, whose quick action saved Emma Patterson's life. The next morning brought the consequences. Mayor Hutchins stood in her clinic, hat in hands, looking deeply uncomfortable. Miss Hale, I appreciate what you're trying to do. But what, Mayor? Should I have let the child burn? Of course not. But publicly praising, that is, drawing attention to... Well, it's causing talk. Good, Margaret said briskly. Organizing already clean instruments. This town could use more talk about heroism and less about gossip. The town council is concerned. Some members think perhaps we were hasty in approving your position. Margaret turned to face him fully. Mayor Hutchins, in the 3 months I've been here, I've delivered 4 babies, treated countless injuries, and prevented at least 2 deaths from infection. If the council wishes to dismiss me because I refuse to shun a man who saves children, then they'll need to find another nurse who'll work for what you're paying. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. He knew as well as she did that no qualified nurse would come to Dry Willow for the meager salary offered. Just be discreet, he finally said, for everyone's sake. After he left, Margaret stood alone in the clinic Abel had built, looking at the steady shelves and solid furniture. Every piece showed the same care he'd used with Emma, strength employed gently, power under perfect control. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Patterson stood in the doorway, Emma's hand in hers. I wanted to thank you, the woman said, and to apologize, for listening to talk, for believing... She stopped, then started again. That man saved my baby. I don't care if he's 7 feet tall or 17, he saved her. Emma broke free and ran to Margaret, pressing something into her hand. It was one of Abel's carved animals, a small wooden horse with delicate legs and a flowing mane. Mister, Abel gave it to me, Emma said solemnly. When I was scared, he said horses are brave, and I could be brave too. Margaret's throat tightened. That's a fine horse. Emma, you take good care of it. After they left, Margaret turned the carving over in her hands, marveling at the intricate details carved by fingers that could bend iron. This was the truth Wade Caldwell and his ilk couldn't see, that gentleness and strength weren't opposites, but partners, each giving meaning to the other. She placed the horse on her desk where she could see it, a small wooden reminder of what courage looked like. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers, new attempts to divide the town by fear. But today, a giant had saved a child, and a child had found bravery in a wooden horse. That was enough truth to build on, one small act at a time. The Harvest Dance was Dry Willow's biggest social event of the year, held in the Olsons' barn that had been cleared of hay and strung with lanterns. Margaret wore her best dress, dark blue wool with mother-of-pearl buttons, and tried to quiet the flutter in her stomach as she entered the warm, crowded space. The fiddler was already playing, couples spinning across the floor in a lively reel. Children darted between dancers' legs, while older folks lined the walls, tapping their feet and gossiping behind raised hands. The air smelled of apple cider, fresh bread, and the underlying sweetness of grain. Margaret spotted Abel immediately. He was impossible to miss, standing near the barn door like a mountain trying to blend into the landscape. He'd clearly made an effort, wearing a clean white shirt and dark vest, his usually unruly hair slicked back with pomade. He looked profoundly uncomfortable. She made her way through the crowd, noting how conversation stuttered as she passed. 3 months of whispers hadn't dimmed since the fire. If anything, they'd grown stronger as she continued to treat Abel's occasional injuries, and he continued to help with clinic repairs. Mr. Cross, she said, reaching his corner, you clean up nicely. A faint color touched his weathered cheeks. "Margaret, you look—" He stopped, seeming to weigh the propriety of compliments. "Very fine." The fiddler struck up a slower tune, a waltz. Couples moved onto the floor with practiced ease, the barn filling with the swish of skirts and gentle laughter. Margaret watched them, remembering the last time she'd danced. Thomas had been alive then, though already coughing, already dying without either of them admitting it. "Do you dance?" she asked Abel, surprising herself with the question. He looked down at his large boots as if they'd personally offended him. "Never learned. My size. It seemed better not to try." Margaret felt a flash of indignation at all the things this man had taught himself not to do, not to want, not to hope for. "It's not difficult," she said. "Just counting in patterns, rather like building, actually." "Margaret, one dance," she said firmly. "The barn's crowded enough that people are already talking. We might as well give them something worth discussing." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then, with the careful movements she'd come to recognize, he offered his hand. It engulfed hers completely, calloused and warm. They found a spot near the edge of the floor. Margaret positioned his right hand at her waist, felt him tense at the contact. "Gentle pressure," she instructed. "Like holding reins. Now, we count in threes. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. They began to move, Abel counting under his breath with fierce concentration. His steps were hesitant at first, too careful, as if the floor might break beneath him. But gradually, as the music continued and Margaret counted softly along with him, something shifted. He began to feel the rhythm, to trust his feet. "That's it," Margaret encouraged. "Just like that." They made a full circuit of their small space without mishap. Abel's confidence grew, and with it, a grace she hadn't expected. For all his size, he moved with the same precise control he brought to everything. Economical, purposeful, surprisingly light. "You're a natural," she said, and meant it. "You're a good teacher." His hand at her waist relaxed slightly. "Though I suspect you're making it easier than it is." "Nonsense. You just needed someone to show you the steps." The music swelled, other couples spinning past in a blur of color. For a moment, Margaret forgot the watching eyes, the whispers, the weight of propriety. There was only the music and the steady count and Abel's careful hands guiding her through the turns. Then the fiddle cut off mid-note. Wade Caldwell stood by the musician's platform, whiskey bottle in hand, his father and several ranch hands behind him. The silence that fell was complete, broken only by the rustle of fabric as dancers stepped apart. "Well, well," Wade's voice carried across the barn. "The giant's got himself a dancing teacher. Ain't that sweet?" "Wade," his father warned, but half-heartedly. James Caldwell's expression suggested he wasn't entirely opposed to his son's interruption. Wade sauntered onto the dance floor, boots loud on the wooden boards. "Tell me, Miss Hale, does he step on your feet? Must be like dancing with a plow horse." "The only ungraceful person here," Margaret said coolly, "is the drunk one interrupting the festivities." Laughter rippled through the crowd, quickly stifled. But there, Wade's face darkened. "You think you're clever," he said, moving closer. The smell of whiskey was strong. "City woman, coming here, stirring things up. But I know what you're really after." "Enlighten me," Margaret said, though Abel's hand tightened warningly on hers. "His land," Wade announced triumphantly. "Oh yeah, Giant here don't just work for my PA. He's got himself a sweet little parcel out by Willow Creek. Been homesteading it for years. Quiet-like, prime grazing land. Good water rights. You figured a man his size, ugly as sin, would be grateful for any woman's attention. Easy pickings for a widow with empty pockets." The accusation was so unexpected, so wildly off mark, that Margaret actually laughed. "Mr. Caldwell, I had no idea, Mr. Cross-owned land, though I'm pleased to hear it. A man should have something of his own to build on." "Don't play innocent with me. That's enough." Abel's voice was quiet, but it filled the barn like thunder. He stepped forward, placing himself between Margaret and Wade. "You've been drinking? Go home." "Or what?" Wade swayed but held his ground. "You'll squeeze me like you did that fellow in Montana?" "Oh yeah, I heard about that. Killed a man with your bare hands, didn't you?" The crowd drew back as if Abel might demonstrate. Margaret saw his hands clench, then deliberately relax. "The man you're talking about," Abel said slowly, "was beating his horse to death. I stopped him, held him until the sheriff came. He died 2 days later from the drink. Not from me." "That's not how I heard it." "Then you heard wrong." Abel looked around the barn, meeting eyes that quickly dropped away. "Anyone wants to know about my past, they can ask me direct. I've got nothing to hide." He turned to Margaret. "I should go. Thank you for the dance." "Abel, wait." But he was already moving, the crowd parting before him like water. Margaret stood alone in the circle of watchers, anger burning hot in her chest. "Proud of yourself?" she asked Wade. He smirked. "Someone had to show you what you're dealing with. Man like that, he's not natural. My PA only keeps him on because he does the work of 3 men without complaint," Margaret finished. "Because he's reliable and honest and has never given anyone a moment's true trouble except in your imagination." She looked around the barn, at the faces she'd come to know these past months. Mrs. Patterson was there, little Emma clinging to her skirts, the widow Chen, whose arthritis Margaret treated weekly, Tom Brennan, whose broken arm she'd set. "I've been in this town 4 months, Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly. "In that time, I've seen Abel Cross build a clinic for you all. I've seen him save a child from fire. I've seen him train horses and tend bees and create beautiful things with his hands. And I've seen him endure suspicion and cruelty with more grace than any of you deserve." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "Oh, and Mr. Caldwell?" "I have money of my own. From my late husband's insurance. I came to Dry Willow because I wanted to help people, not to trap some man for his land. Though now that I know Abel has property, I'm even more impressed. It takes courage to build something in a place that fears you." The cool night air hit her heated face as she left the barn. She could hear voices rising behind her, arguments breaking out, the dance thoroughly ruined. Good. Let them talk. She found Abel by the corrals, leaning against the fence and watching the horses. The moonlight turned his white shirt silver. "I'm sorry," he said without turning. "I shouldn't have agreed to dance. Knew it would cause trouble." "The only thing you should apologize for is leaving me to face that crowd alone," Margaret said, joining him at the fence. "Though I think I managed well enough." A small smile touched his lips. "Heard some of it. You've got away with words. I've got away with the truth." She studied his profile in the moonlight. "Is it true about the land?" He nodded. 160 acres out by the creek. Filed on it 5 years ago. Been proving it up slow. Built a cabin. Run some cattle. It's not much, but it's mine. It's everything," Margaret said softly. "A place of your own, where you don't have to make yourself small." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the horses shift and breathe. From the barn, music started up again, tentative at first, then stronger. The dance would continue, as dances always did, around whatever drama had interrupted them. "I meant what I said," Margaret told him, "about you having more grace than they deserve. A lesser man would have thrown Wade through a wall tonight. Throwing him wouldn't change his mind, just confirm what he already believes." "And what do you believe?" Abel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I believe you dance like you heal, with kindness and patience. I believe this town is lucky to have you, even if they're too foolish to see it. And I believe I'm going to remember that waltz for a long, long time." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. "Well then, Mr. Cross, perhaps we should practice again sometime. Privately, away from drunken interruptions." "That's not wise. Wisdom is overrated," Margaret said firmly. "I prefer courage." She left him there by the corrals and walked back to her boarding house, head high despite the stares from people spilling out of the barn. Let them watch. Let them whisper. She'd danced with a giant tonight and found him graceful. That was worth any amount of gossip. The first wisps of smoke appeared at dawn, rising from the Red Butte supplies shed like accusing fingers. By the time the alarm bell rang, flames had already consumed half the structure, devouring winter feed and expensive tools with hungry enthusiasm. Abel arrived with the other hands to find chaos. Men formed bucket brigades while Caldwell shouted orders, his face purple with rage. The fire was too far gone to save the shed, but they might keep it from spreading to the main barn. "My new plows were in there," Caldwell roared. 3 months' worth of grain. Someone's going to hang for this. They fought the fire until noon, when only smoking ruins remained. Abel's shoulders ached from hauling water. His hands blistered despite their calluses. As the men gathered to assess the damage, Wade appeared from behind the tool shed, holding something triumphantly. "Found our fire starter," he announced, raising a distinctive boot print preserved in the mud near the building. The print was enormous, with a peculiar wear pattern on the heel. "Recognize this, boys?" Abel looked down at his own boots, seeing the matching wear from years of compensating for his height in the stirrups. His stomach turned to lead. "That's Cross's print, sure enough," one of the hands confirmed reluctantly. "Seen it enough times." Caldwell's eyes glittered dangerously. "You burned my shed. Cross." "No, sir. I was in my bunk all night. The boys can confirm—" "I was dead asleep." Another hand interrupted. "Could have marched an army through and I wouldn't have noticed." "Same here," others mumbled. Nobody could provide an alibi. Wade smiled coldly. "Makes sense, doesn't it? Giant here's been acting mighty independent lately, dancing with that nurse, building things in town. Maybe he figured he didn't need this job anymore. Maybe he wanted to hurt us on his way out." "That's not true," Abel said. But he could see the doubt spreading across faces. His size, which made him valuable for work, also made him the perfect suspect for destruction. "Pack your things," Caldwell said. "You're done here, and if I find one shred of proof you set that fire, I'll see you in prison." Abel didn't argue. What was the point? He gathered his few possessions while the other hands watched silently, then saddled his horse and rode away from Red Butte for the last time. The news reached town before he did. Margaret was treating Mrs. Morrison's rheumatism when she heard the commotion outside. Through the window, she saw a mob gathering, Wade at its center. "The giant burned down Pa's shed," Wade announced to anyone who'd listen. "Probably planning to burn the whole ranch, maybe the town too. That's what happens when you let outsiders think they belong." Margaret's hand stilled on Mrs. Morrison's swollen joints. "Excuse me," she said quietly, then walked outside. "That's a serious accusation. Mr. Caldwell," she said, "do you have proof beyond a footprint?" Wade's smile was triumphant. "What more proof do you need? His boot, his grudge, his crime." "His grudge? The man's worked loyally for your father for years." "Until you came along," Wade shot back, filling his head with ideas, making him think he was better than he is. "This is your fault as much as his." The crowd murmured agreement. Margaret saw fear in their faces, fear of change, of difference, of anything that challenged their small world view. "You're right," she said clearly. "This is my fault. I treated Abel Cross like a human being instead of a monster. How foolish of me." She turned and walked back into the clinic, shutting the door firmly behind her. But she could hear Wade continuing his poison, working the crowd into a frenzy. By nightfall, there would be talk of vigilante justice. Margaret made her decision quickly. She packed medical supplies and food, then hitched up her small cart. She knew where Abel's homestead was. He'd described it once, out by Willow Creek, where his bees made their home. The storm hit just as she cleared the town limits. Not rain, but snow, thick, heavy flakes that seemed impossible for October. The temperature plummeted, wind picking up until she could barely see the road. But she pressed on, terrified of what might happen if the mob reached Abel first. She found his cabin by pure luck, nearly running into the fence in the whiteout conditions. It was small but sturdily built, with smoke rising from the chimney. Abel emerged before she could knock, his face showing shock at her presence. "Margaret, what are you— the storm! They're coming," she gasped through chattering teeth. "Wade's got them worked up about vigilante justice. You need to leave. I'm not running." He guided her inside, where blessed warmth hit her like a wall. "Didn't do anything wrong. That won't matter if they—" Margaret stopped, listening. Through the wind, she heard horses, many horses. Abel heard them too. His face settled into resigned lines. "Get in the root cellar, whatever happens. I'm not hiding." Margaret's chin lifted. "We'll face them together." But the horses passed by, the riders apparently lost in the storm. As minutes stretched with no attack, a different worry took hold. Those men were out in killing weather, probably turned around in the whiteout. "They'll die out there," Margaret said. Abel was already reaching for his coat. "There's a line shack about 2 miles north. If they missed it in the storm, you can't go after men who want to hang you. Can't let them freeze either." He wrapped scarves around his face, grabbed a coil of rope. "Stay here. Keep the fire going. I'll send them back as I find them." He disappeared into the white wall of snow before she could protest further. Margaret tended the fire and heated water, preparing for hypothermia cases. The first rider arrived within an hour. Tom Brennan, barely conscious. Led by his horse that Abel had turned back toward the cabin, Margaret worked to warm him, stripping wet clothes and wrapping him in blankets. More men arrived in 1s and 2s, all in various stages of cold injury. She treated them mechanically, trying not to think about Abel out in the killing storm. Wade Caldwell came last, draped over Abel's shoulders like a sack of grain. The younger man was unconscious, his lips blue, ice crystals in his hair. Abel laid him by the fire and immediately turned to leave again. "There's 2 more out there," he said shortly. "Abel, you can't—" But he was gone. Margaret worked on Wade, applying everything she knew about cold exposure. Slowly, painfully. Warmth returned to his extremities. He moaned, eyelids fluttering. The storm raged for 3 hours. When it finally began to ease, 11 men crowded Abel's small cabin, all alive thanks to his efforts. Abel himself sat in the corner, exhausted, his massive frame shaking with cold despite the blankets Margaret had forced on him. As consciousness fully returned to the rescued men, an awkward silence fell. They'd come to deliver frontier justice and had instead been saved by their intended victim. Wade was the last to fully wake. He stared around the cabin, taking in the scene, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been shame. "You could have let us die," he said hoarsely. Abel shrugged. "Could have. Why didn't you?" "Because that's not who I am." Abel met his eyes steadily. "No matter what stories you tell about me." Tom Brennan cleared his throat. "About that fire. Cross, I've been thinking. That boot print, it was deep, but not deep enough for a man your weight. And facing the wrong direction, like someone walking backward in your boots." Others nodded slowly, in the warmth of the cabin. With their lives newly saved, the truth seemed clearer. "Wade," Brennan continued quietly, "where were you before you found that print?" Wade's face flushed. "I don't have to—" "Your pa's been pushing Cross hard lately," another man observed. "And you've been pushing your PA about getting rid of him. Mighty convenient. That fire." The accusation hung in the air. Wade looked around the cabin, finding no support in the faces of men who'd nearly died following his lead. "I didn't mean for it to go so far," he said finally, the words barely audible. "Just wanted him gone, wanted things back to how they were." Margaret felt no satisfaction at the confession, only a deep weariness. "And now?" she asked. Wade couldn't meet anyone's eyes. "Now I reckon I owe him my life. We all do." As dawn broke clear and cold, the men prepared to leave. They shook Abel's hand one by one, mumbling thanks and apologies. Wade went last, his movements stiff with more than cold. "I'll tell Pa the truth," he said. Don't know if he'll believe me, but I'll tell him. Abel nodded. That's a start. After they'd gone, Margaret and Abel stood in the doorway, watching the sun turn the snow-covered landscape into a field of diamonds. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving it bright and new. You should have let me freeze, Margaret said. Coming out in that storm, it was foolish. Pot calling the kettle black. Abel replied, You're the one who drove through a blizzard to warn me. Yes, well, I have a weakness for lost causes. That what I am, a lost cause? Margaret looked up at him. This giant of a man who'd risked his life for those who'd wished him harm. No, she said softly. You're the furthest thing from it. Something shifted in his weathered face. Margaret, I know, she said, and somehow, she did. The words didn't need saying. Not yet. They'd been written in every action. His patience with the town's fear, her refusal to bow to their prejudice, their partnership in healing both bodies and hearts. Come on, she said, taking his arm. Let's get you properly warmed up. I have a feeling there'll be more visitors soon, once word spreads about what really happened. As they turned back to the cabin, neither saw Wade's boot prints in the snow, the ones with the peculiar marks from where he'd hammered nails through the soles to mimic Abel's worn heel pattern. The evidence would melt with the snow, but the truth would remain, carried in the hearts of 11 men who'd learned the difference between size and character on the coldest night of their lives. The town meeting convened in the church on a crisp November morning, every pew filled with curious faces. Mayor Hutchins stood at the pulpit, looking uncomfortable as Sheriff Morgan led Wade Caldwell to the front. The younger man's swagger was gone, replaced by something hollow and deflated. We're here to address the fire at Red Butte Ranch. The mayor began. New evidence has come to light. Tom Brennan stood first. I examined the scene yesterday with fresh eyes. Found something interesting. He produced a boot sole with nails hammered through in a distinctive pattern. This was hidden in Wade's saddlebag. Matches the prints by the burned shed exactly. A murmur ran through the congregation. James Caldwell sat rigid in the front row, his face carved from stone. That true, son? Sheriff Morgan asked. Wade's yes was barely audible. Louder, so everyone can hear. The sheriff insisted. Yes, Wade's voice cracked. I set the fire. I made it look like Cross did it. I wanted him gone because... He stopped, swallowing hard. Because I was afraid of how things were changing, of how people were starting to respect him instead of fear him. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret, sitting in the back, watched Abel's face remain carefully neutral despite the vindication. Sheriff Morgan cleared his throat. Abel Cross saved 11 men in that blizzard, including the one who tried to frame him. That speaks to character more than any words could. He turned to Wade. You'll work off the damages at Red Butte, every penny, and you'll do it alongside Mr. Cross, if he's willing to return. James Caldwell finally stood, his movements those of an old man. Cross, he said, voice rough. I owe you an apology, and your job back, with a raise, if you'll have it. Abel rose from his pew, having to duck beneath the church beams. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Caldwell, but I think it's time I focused on my own place. Got cattle to tend and bees to prepare for winter. Then we'll buy your honey. Mrs. Patterson spoke up suddenly. All of it. The town should support a man who's done nothing but good for us. Others voiced agreement. The widow Chen offered to trade preserves. Tom Brennan volunteered lumber for expanding Abel's barn. It was as if the town's conscience had suddenly awakened, eager to make amends. After the meeting dispersed, Margaret found Abel by the willows where he kept his hives. He was checking the boxes, ensuring they were secure for winter. That was quite a turnabout, she said. Guilt's a powerful motivator. He adjusted a hive cover with gentle hands. Won't last, probably, but it's something. You're too cynical. Am I? He straightened, looking down at her. Margaret, they're offering acceptance because I saved their lives. What happens when the memory fades? When the next stranger comes to town? She had no easy answer for that. Instead, she said, Then we teach them better, one person at a time. They walked among the hives in companionable silence, the late autumn sun warm on their faces. Finally, Abel stopped by a massive willow, its branches creating a natural shelter. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly, "about why I really left Montana." Margaret waited, sensing the weight of what was coming. "There was a woman there, Anna. We were close. I thought we'd marry." His hands clenched and unclenched. "Then one day she told me she was afraid. Not of anything I'd done, but of what I might do, of what people said I could do. She couldn't get past the fear. Abel, I left the next week. Couldn't stay where someone I loved looked at me and saw a monster." He met her eyes. "I need to know, Margaret, when you look at me, what do you see?" Margaret stepped closer, having to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "I see a man who builds instead of destroys, who heals instead of hurts, who saved the lives of those who wished him harm." She reached up, laying her hand against his chest. "I see someone who spent so long being careful with his strength that he's forgotten how to accept gentleness." His hand covered hers, engulfing it completely. "I could hurt you without meaning to. You could. Any man could hurt any woman if he chose to. But you won't." She pressed closer. "You won't, because hurting goes against everything you are." He pulled her against him then, carefully, as if she were made of spun glass. Margaret wrapped her arms around him as far as they would go, feeling the tension in his massive frame slowly ease. "I love you," he said into her hair. "Tried not to, but I do." "Thank goodness," she murmured against his chest. "I'd hate to be the only one feeling this way." They stood there among the drowsing bees until the sun began to sink, neither willing to break the moment. Finally, Abel pulled back enough to look at her face. "Would you marry me?" The words came out in a rush. "I know it's not what you planned, coming here, and people will talk, they always talk, but I've got the land and the bees, and I'm building the herd. It's not much, but yes." He blinked. "Yes. Yes, Abel Cross. I'll marry you." She smiled at his stunned expression. "Though I do have conditions. Anything. I keep working at the clinic. We expand it, make it a proper hospital eventually. And we add a schoolroom. This town needs education as much as it needs healing. Done. And you teach the children woodworking. Show them that hands can create beautiful things, no matter their size." His throat worked. "Margaret, those are my terms," she said firmly. "Take them or leave them. I take them." He fumbled in his pocket, producing something wrapped in soft leather. "I made this weeks ago. Wasn't sure I'd ever have the courage to give it to you." Inside was a ring carved from pale honey-colored wood, delicate as lace despite being solid through. Tiny flowers and leaves wound around the band, each detail perfect. "It's applewood," he said shyly. "From the tree behind the clinic, where you hung the sign with my name on it, as one of the builders." Margaret's eyes blurred as he slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the meadow behind the clinic. Pastor Williams officiated, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. It seemed the whole town had come, even those who'd whispered the loudest. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, with late wildflowers in her hair. Abel had somehow procured a proper suit that actually accommodated his frame, though he tugged at the collar nervously. "Do you, Margaret Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Pastor Williams asked. "I do," Margaret said clearly, her eyes never leaving Abel's face. "And do you, Abel Cross, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was steady. "Sure. Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you man and wife." Abel bent carefully to kiss his bride, mindful as always of his strength. But Margaret would have none of it, pulling him down for a proper kiss that left no doubt in anyone's mind about her feelings. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Tables groaned under the weight of donated food. Children ran between the adults' legs. Clutching wooden animals Abel had carved as wedding favors. Even James Caldwell attended, Wade at his side looking subdued but present. As the sun set, Abel and Margaret stood together, watching their community, for it was theirs now. Truly theirs, celebrate around them. No regrets? Abel asked quietly. Only one, Margaret said. I wish I'd come to Dry Willow sooner. He pulled her close, no longer afraid of his own gentleness. You came when you were meant to, when we were both ready. The stars came out one by one, blessing the union of the giant and the healer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that strength and tenderness could coexist. But tonight, there was only joy and hope, and the promise of a life built together on foundations as solid as the mountains that watched over them all. The sign read, Soft Heart Apiary and Clinic, in letters carved with the same careful precision that marked all of Abel's work. 1 year after their wedding, the expanded facility bustled with purposeful activity. Margaret supervised 2 assistant nurses she'd trained from among the town's young women, while Abel's woodworking workshop occupied the adjoining building where children learned to shape beauty from raw timber. Mrs. Cross, we need you. Young Sarah Chen, one of the new nurses, called from the examination room. The Johansson baby's coming early. Margaret hurried to assist, her movements efficient despite her own expanding waistline. At 6 months pregnant, she'd refused to slow down, much to Abel's gentle concern. The delivery was swift and safe, another life brought into the world within walls her husband had built. As she cleaned up afterward, Margaret heard the familiar sound of Abel's teaching voice through the connecting door. Remember, the wood will tell you how it wants to be shaped. You just have to listen. She peeked in to see him crouched beside little Emma Patterson, his massive hands guiding her small ones as she carved her first spoon. Other children watched intently, no longer seeing a giant to fear but a patient teacher who never raised his voice. The telegraph in the corner clicked to life. A message from Laramie requesting their honey-based wound salve recipe. Margaret smiled as she transcribed it. Their treatments had gained recognition throughout the territory, with doctors writing from as far as Denver for advice. That evening, Abel found her in their garden, harvesting herbs for the next batch of medicines. The rows of plants thrived under her care, just as the expanded bee colony thrived under his. He moved between the rows carefully, still conscious of his size even after a year of marriage. How's our little one today? He asked, placing a gentle hand on her rounded belly. Active, Margaret replied, leaning into his touch. I think we're raising a dancer. Or a carpenter, Abel suggested. All that tapping might be hammer practice. They worked together in comfortable silence, filling baskets with chamomile, echinacea, and calendula. The setting sun painted the mountains gold, and the air hummed with the sound of returning bees. Letter came today, Abel said eventually. From the territorial government, they want to officially recognize the clinic as a teaching hospital. Would mean funding, proper equipment. Margaret straightened, hope blooming in her chest. Oh, Abel, truly. Seems word spread about what we've built here. He paused. What you've built. What we've built, she corrected firmly. None of this would exist without you. A commotion from the road drew their attention. A wagon approached at dangerous speed, the driver whipping his horses frantically. As it drew closer, they recognized Sam Martinez from the railroad camp. Please, he shouted. There's been an explosion. 20 men injured, maybe more. We need... Margaret was already moving. Sarah, Anna, prepare everything we have. Abel, we'll need the wagon. Within minutes, they were racing toward the railroad camp, medical supplies packed carefully in Abel's specially reinforced wagon. The scene that greeted them was chaos, men scattered across the ground, some moaning, others ominously still. A powder charge had detonated prematurely in the tunnel they were blasting. Margaret took charge immediately, triaging the wounded with her assistants. The worst cases needed surgery, procedures she'd only read about but never performed. I need more light, she said, examining a man with metal shrapnel embedded in his chest. Abel disappeared and returned with mirrors from the camp, positioning them to catch and redirect the fading sunlight. He became her surgical assistant without being asked, his steady hands perfect for holding instruments and maintaining pressure where needed. They worked through the night, saving lives that would have been lost without their intervention. Abel's strength proved invaluable, lifting men, holding lanterns for hours without wavering, even donating blood when one patient needed it desperately. As dawn broke, 18 of the 20 injured men were stable. The 2 they'd lost had been beyond anyone's help, their injuries too severe. Margaret sat exhausted on a crate, her hands still trembling from the night's work. "You did it," Abel said softly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "We did it," she corrected, then gasped. "Oh, what? Are you hurt?" His concern was immediate. "No, oh." She grabbed his hand, placing it on her belly. "Feel that?" Under his palm. A firm kick pressed outward. Abel's face transformed with wonder. "Strong little thing," he murmured. "Like the father," Margaret said, then had to laugh at his expression. "Don't look so worried. I've delivered dozens of babies. I know what I'm doing." "It's different when it's yours," he said. "Ours." The railroad company sent a hefty donation to the clinic in gratitude, enough to fund the expansion they dreamed of. By harvest time, the Soft Heart Apiary and Clinic had become a true medical center, with a surgical theater, recovery rooms, and a classroom where Margaret taught everything from basic hygiene to advanced medical techniques. The autumn harvest celebration found the town transformed. Where once suspicion had reigned, now pride filled the air. Dry Willow had become known as the place where healing happened, where strangers were welcomed, where different kinds of strength were valued. Abel stood before the crowd, holding their month-old daughter, Rose. She was tiny in his massive arms, but he held her with the same gentle confidence he brought to everything. Margaret watched from her seat, still recovering from the birth, but glowing with contentment. "Speech," someone called out, and others took up the cry. Abel looked uncomfortable, but Margaret nodded encouragingly. He cleared his throat. "Year and a half ago, I was ready to leave this place," he said, his deep voice carrying easily. "Figured there was no room here for someone like me. Then Margaret came to town and showed us all what we were missing. Not just in doctoring, but in seeing each other clear." He looked down at Rose, who was gumming his thumb contentedly. "This little one will grow up in a different Dry Willow than the one I knew. A place where strength means building up, not tearing down, where different folks work together instead of apart, where the size of your hands matters less than what you do with them." His eyes found Margaret's. "That's the gift my wife gave this town, not just healing for the body, but for the spirit too. I'm just the lucky man who gets to build the furniture." Laughter rippled through the crowd, warm and genuine. As the celebration continued around them, Margaret made her way to her husband's side. Together they stood watching their community, ranchers and railroad workers, longtime residents and newcomers, all mingling freely. "No regrets?" Abel asked, echoing his question from their wedding day. Margaret took Rose from his arms, cradling their daughter close. "How could I regret the life we've built, the home we've made?" The baby opened her eyes, her father's eyes, thoughtful and deep, and yawned mightily. Abel wrapped his arms around both of them, no longer afraid of his own strength, knowing it was matched by their trust. As the stars came out over Wyoming, the telegraph in the clinic began clicking. Another town, another request for help, another chance to spread the healing they'd found. Margaret smiled, already planning tomorrow's work. There would be patients to treat, students to teach, medicines to prepare. But tonight, she stood in the circle of her husband's arms, their daughter between them, surrounded by a community that had learned to see past fear to the truth of the heart. It was everything she'd never known to hope for when she'd stepped off that dusty stagecoach, and more than she'd ever dreamed possible. In the distance, Abel's bees hummed in their hives, preparing for winter, storing sweetness against the cold days ahead. They had learned, as had the people of Dry Willow, that sometimes the gentlest touch came from the strongest hands, and that love could bloom in the most unexpected places. The circle was complete, from fear to understanding, from isolation to community, from strangers to family. And at the heart of it all, a giant soft heart had shown them the way home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying these tales from, whether you're listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps working on your own projects. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback helps me know what stories resonate with you, and I enjoy reading about your own experiences with love, acceptance, and the power of looking beyond appearances. Don't forget to share this story with others who might need a reminder that strength and gentleness can exist in the same heart.